Well, welcome everybody to this broadcast. What we're going to be doing today is doing one of our Highrock hot takes on it's beyond black and white. So much of the conversation recently has been about the relationship, this fraught, tragic relationship between Black Americans and white Americans. And yet there's other populations, notably Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, who are being left out of this conversation. So we're going to give it a few minutes as people are logging on. But what we're going to do is I'm going to kind of introduce this in a little bit, and then I'm going to introduce our panelists who are each going to share. And these are people you really want to hear. Believe me, they've just got a lot of great stuff. And then we're going to go to questions. And so if you put questions in the comments, I should be able to see those, and I can put those to the panelists, and we'll be able to have a dialogue that way. So you really can be a part of this. So I'm just going to wait just about 30 seconds or a little less as we're waiting for people to jump on with us, and then we're going to dive in. All right. Well, people are jumping on, so here we go. Perfect. Thank you. William Ballard says the same thing. Well, everybody, thank you for joining us tonight. You know, since the murder of George Floyd, we've been giving much more very long overdue attention to the problems of racism in our society. But almost all of that has been focused on Black Americans, in part because it's some of the most egregious and enduring. But many other important stories have gotten lost in that conversation, as I said, including those of Latino Americans, Latin Americans, Native Americans, Arab Americans, and Asian Americans. And we're hosting this event tonight because we've seen a recent explosion in violence and racism against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. But this kind of racism has much deeper roots than just the recent events. AAPIs have always occupied a volatile spot in the middle of the totem pole of American privilege. For example, in the 1880s, in fact, I got a picture here I wanted to share with you. In the 1880s, the single Chinese men were recruited to come to the United States to do menial and backbreaking work, building the American railway system. And they were initially accepted because they were helping America prosper. But every time the economy wobbles, the AAPIs were suddenly seen as a threat to low-wage white workers and pushed back to the margins. And we saw this again and again and again throughout history. We saw it most explicitly with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was the first legislation to specifically exclude certain immigrants on the basis of race. We saw it again during World War II when Japanese Americans were jailed in internment camps. And we've seen this tendency to keep pushing people to the margins whenever the white middle class feels insecure. So right now, we're in a period of insecurity and instability. It's no surprise that AAPIs are once again being targeted. And now it's easy to blame a recent president who stoked racism by calling, the coronavirus Kung flu and China virus, but really he was just exploiting the angst that went way beyond the virus. Coronavirus coming from China seems to me like a smaller factor than the fact that the wages of the average American worker are stagnating, while one of the greatest competitors to America's international dominance is now China. Then in March, millions of low-wage white Americans, who were barely making as it was, suddenly lost their jobs. And we needed someone to blame besides ourselves. And that's a role that AAPIs have often been saddled with throughout our history. But this is what Trump was tapping into. We white people tend to deny the existence of systemic racism because protecting the current system benefits us. But that is dishonest and dangerous for our friends of color, whom we claim to love. We white people need to be in this conversation because when white Americans feel threatened, we reflexively turn back to our caste system to restore our intrinsic sense of superiority that doesn't need to be earned or proven. It's just bestowed at birth. And I think that's what white supremacy is all about. It's a system that shifts the rules as a way of protecting the privilege of those in power. If we understand whiteness not as a genetic trait, but as a social classification regarding whether somebody is in the in-group or out-group in American society. AAPIs are in an awkward middle position that shifts depending what's going on in our society. Probably most notably, the economy. Whenever the myth of American meritocracy isn't working for white people, we turn to racism to restore our dominant position. We've seen this with many other immigrant groups. When I was a kid growing up in Boston, Italians weren't seen as white, which justified their relatively poor living and working conditions. They were often cast as criminals. But when it became advantageous for those in power, classification changed from non-white to white in order to perpetuate the system of white superiority. And that's why it's imperative that we understand that whiteness is not a skin color, but a social classification. There are many Asians who have lighter skin than I do, and many people of European extraction who have much darker skin. But whiteness is not about skin tone, it's about status. It uses a complex and shifting set of rules to determine who is on top and who's on the bottom. And this, I think, is where racism against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders intersects with all this conversation we've been having about Black Lives Matter and all that we've been learning. So today we've got three panelists who are going to help us sort through all this. Pastor Richard Lee is part of our Revelation 7 faculty, and he's a Korean American. Pastor Kat Hampson currently serves Highrock Quincy and is in the middle of an exciting development within the Highrock network we'll let you know about later. And more from her in the next few weeks on that. She's a Filipino American, and Pastor Deandre Dukes serves the Cambridge, Arlington, Lexington, Metro West congregations and is a Black American. Now, all three of these pastors love God, and they love our church, and they have thought deeply about race and racism. So while they may have some hard things to say, I hope we can all hear it because they speak the truth in love. And I ask my fellow European Americans to listen without defensiveness. Decades ago, I used to deny that racism was real because I never saw it. But of course, I never saw it. I'm white. The only way I can learn about it is from listening to and trusting the stories of those who have experienced. Now, initially, I'm going to ask them to share their experiences and reflections, but then we're going to turn again to your questions. And so that's, if you could put those things in the chat, I'm going to try to scan through them and pull them out and put them to the panel. Pastor Richard, I want to start with you. According to the American meritocracy myth, you are near the top of the ladder, right? You've earned impressive degrees, you've succeeded in your career, you own a house in the suburbs, and I think actually you were even born in America. This is your home. And yet all of these things have not protected you from discrimination. Could you share with us a couple of examples of the way that you or sort of your community have experienced racism?
Yeah, thank you, Dave. Thank you, Highrock family. It's a privilege to be here, and especially engaging in this conversation that is wrought with difficulty, right? I mean, everybody's worried about saying the wrong thing to the wrong person in the wrong way, and so I was just grateful for the grace extended to all the panelists here as we engage in this difficult conversation. I was born in the 70s, mid 70s, grew up in the 80s in Northeast New Jersey. And, one of the interesting things about the town that I lived in when I was growing up was actually there was a pretty good number of Asian Americans in my school, specifically Korean Americans. I think at the time they were saying it was like 25% to 33% Asian American, which is large numbers even for today, let alone back in the 80s. I remember, so my parents immigrated here, and they actually made the choice to raise their kids, us, me and my brothers, on English. And so I grew up with very little familiarity with the Korean culture. My mom would make more fried chicken than she would make kalbi, like Korean barbecue. And so I grew up in a very intentionally deliberate, yellow hued white household, right? I mean, as much as two immigrant Koreans could make, their kids assimilate. And so very much so, I think very early on, I was sort of, my goal was to assimilate. My goal was to become as white as possible. And there were, when I say my school was 25 to 33% Asian American, a lot of those were immigrants immigrant families, and so a lot of those people didn't speak English well or at all. And I just remember growing up wanting to distance myself and say, I'm not like them. Don't put me with them. I'm different. I'm like you guys. And I remember specifically, this is when I was 12 years old. We were in the back of a pizzeria playing an arcade game. And kids, if you don't know what that is, ask your parents. You're going to say something, Dave?
Hey, Richard, I'm missing a bunch kind of popping out. I don't know if it's my connection or yours. Are other people missing some of what Richard is saying?
Am I okay? Yeah?
I'm missing some of it. Kat and Deandre, are you guys hearing him clearly?
Okay.
Yeah, yuck. So maybe it's my connection. I'm sorry to Richard to interrupt. I don't want to miss a word of what you're saying. Go ahead.
Appreciate that. So I was in a pizzeria and I was playing arcade games, and I was hanging out with a bunch of my white friends. And I remember one of the kids who was the most popular started just talking about all these bad things about Asian Americans and saying all these negative things and all this racist stuff. And I remember thinking at that moment, like, oh, this sounds inappropriate. Like this, I should be offended by this. And then my other friend was like, hey, stop saying that stuff. Rich is right here. Like, Richard's right here. Like, stop saying that stuff. And then he looked at me and then he said, oh, but he's not one of them. And then he went on and continued talking. And I remember specifically at 12 years old, having to face the decision of, am I aligning myself with the people that I don't want to be, but who I will always be associated with visually, and get outraged by what I'm hearing? Or do I keep my mouth shut? Do I, find comfort in the fact that he doesn't count me as one of them, and try and sort of hide and mute my racial identity in order to stay as assimilated as possible? But that, for me, growing up, was a moment for me where I was just really faced with the weight of my racial identity, the racialized narrative of who I am. And I didn't handle it well. And I'm there are still moments where I don't handle it well. But I think it was, for me, growing up, the phase of really sort of wanting to assimilate into white culture, and sort of associate with white culture, whether actively or passively, and then really needing to come to grips and come to face the facts with who I am as a Korean American in living in this country, in this society. And I imagine many of the AAPI people in the chat may feel the same way and have faced the same struggle and are maybe actually engaging with this issue even now.
Kat, I'm wondering if I can put that same question to you. Would you be willing to share with us what racism has looked like for you and for your community?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I was not born in the United States. I grew up in the Middle East, in a really international community, and where I grew up, there were racial hierarchies. There were. I don't think we would have called them like racial hierarchies, or I don't know if I would have called them that growing up, but they were very much there. And there was always a sense of like, where do I fit in this ecosystem? And I would look to different people of different ethnicities and say, okay, you're clearly at this part of the hierarchy, and you're clearly at this part. Where am I between? Where's my place in here? And I think coming to the U.S. In college and just staying ever since, there's that similar sense of like, okay, where do I fit in here? I came in as an international student. I became naturalized much later, but the experiences of racism that I've personally felt is just making fun of my people's accent or language, making fun of food, or a family of festivals. I've definitely heard a "go back to where you've come from" yelled at me from cars and trucks and things like that. as people have sped by. And as an Asian American woman, I've definitely encountered the stereotype that people have of Asian American women, and just kind of the submissive sexual stereotype that's there. And so those are examples of what I've experienced. But I know that so Quincy has a large Asian American population, and some experiences of racism that I haven't personally experienced, but members of our Quincy community have, are that one of our community members, who's Chinese American and a doctor, got verbally assaulted by a patient, calling her, Chinese bleep bleep. But this is in the era of COVID. She was trying to help him, and this is the assault that she endured. I'm also on some local Quincy community Facebook groups. And so when COVID started to emerge slowly in the United States through community spread, there were comments that were from white parents that were concerned for their kids' health because they go to a school that had, many Asian Americans. And so I think it's sadly common. And I'd say that there is many, many experiences of racism that my community has. So those are some that I can offer. I do want to offer that racism isn't just interpersonal. Like the experiences that Rich and I share are interpersonal, like they happen to us as individuals, but racism exists systemically. And then there are systems and things that affect Asians and Asian Americans in the United States systemically that feed into interpersonal racism, and very much connected. So we can go into that if we have time, but just wanted to bring that out.
Well, I would like to be able to talk more about some of these things, but I want to ask one question beforehand. And again, I realize my connection is a little bit choppy. I'm sorry about that. I think that there's a lot of, especially white Americans and maybe Black Americans, who tend to lump Asian Americans into one group, as if, sort of all of them just are one thing. But Asian Americans, obviously a lot of difference. And then beyond that, if we're adding in Islanders, much more difference. I wonder if Richard and Kat, if you could kind of walk us through that. What are some of the distinctions? What are some of the tensions? Kind of help us understand what we're talking about when we're talking about AAPIs.
Kat, I'll let you handle that.
Ooh, yes. Yes. So Asian America, not a monolith, and there are many factors that weave into the Asian American story, many facets of that. So I am Filipino, and I'm Filipino American. I got naturalized. Filipino Americans have a long history in the United States. I think even before the country's founding, there were Filipinos who had come to the United States. And the United States has always had a really interesting relationship with the Philippines in terms of colonialism. And so that relationship of colonialism expanded into just Filipinos knowing what the American dream was, even before they were allowed to kind of enter the country or immigrate in mass. The American soldiers fought alongside Filipino soldiers. There was conflict between Filipinos and Americans, and when immigration finally, when the doors of the country were finally open to large numbers of people from all around the world, Filipinos immigrated to the United States in mass, thinking that this was their chance for the American dream. And so we've known how to speak English for a long time. Our story with the United States goes beyond just 1965 Immigration Act. And those are the things that we bring into our story. We have a lot of not crossover, I won't say that. There's resonance in the Filipino American story with stories of the indigenous people. And there's some resonance with stories with Black Americans. But other ethnic group stories coming in are different.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, Dave, is well, two things. One, growing up, I remember specifically constantly being asked, "Are you Chinese? No. Are you Japanese? No. What are you?" And it probably wasn't until the Olympics in Seoul where it was, "Are you Chinese? Are you Japanese? Are you Korean?" And I felt like we made it. Like we made it into the top three, and it was like finally like a legitimate country, like a legitimate nationality. And so from very, very early on, from as young as I can remember, I was already being placed in lists or in a bucket. And what that does to you as growing up is like when somebody's saying like, "Are you Chinese? Are you Japanese?" Like those are the ones that I know. Those are the acceptable ones. Those are the popular ones, or whatever. And then having to then educate whoever I was speaking to, regardless of what age I was, about what Korean is. Oh, where's Korea? Like all of this stuff. So just thinking about the trajectory, and I think now of like, Parasite winning Best Picture, as a Korean American, like that means so much to me because you'd never think of that, from where I was growing up. I will say that what ends up happening for a lot of Asian Americans now is, even as I say that phrase, Asian American, is when we are put in a majority white setting, we identify as Asian American. Kat, what's up? I see you. Like, you're my girl. Like, that's... And then when we're in...
across the room.
That's right. Oh, totally. And then when we're put in predominantly Asian American spaces, it's like, okay, where are my Korean people at? You know what I mean? And so there's a sense in like, if somebody asks me and, I'm a baseball fan. I think of baseball. And so it's like, when Ichiro came in, I was like, Asian Americans rule, this and that. And then when the World Baseball Classic came and Japan's playing Korea, I'm like down with Ichiro. You know what I mean? So there's all of these experiences. And what I mean to say is that there's all these experiences where myself as an Asian American, I have to really choose my association at any given time. And I will say that this extends to whether I choose to identify myself as a person of color or as a person of privilege, because I can navigate the society as a person of privilege, or I could choose to enter into the society as a person of color. And in some ways, Asian Americans have the luxury of choice that so many people don't have. But it is a complex weight that we bear, where every given store, restaurant setting that we walk into, we are, almost passively doing this calculus of who am I in this moment? How am I associating? And I mean, it's tiring. You don't realize it, but it's tiring.
And I will add.
Go ahead, Kat.
There's hope. There is hope in that. This is what I hold on to. The term Asian American was coined in the 1960s by I think it was Berkeley students who were inspired by the Black Power movement, who saw solidarity and said, here, maybe if we can build a coalition, this is a place for solidarity. So, I feel the weight and the exhaustion of like, who do I identify with at all points in time? But I think I hold out for the term where I'm like, you know what? Let's not have whiteness define us. How can we define ourselves in solidarity?
Richard, I wonder if you could just pick up on this, because right after the murder of George Floyd, you wrote what I thought was a very powerful piece, identifying not with George Floyd, nor with his executioner, but with the Asian police officer standing behind them in all of the photos. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about kind of that article, that whole idea, and the larger story this represents to you.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Dave. It was, after the murder of George Floyd, there was so much that was being said, and, the outrage in me, I'm an 8 on the Enneagram. And so I wanted to speak out about it. And I wanted to say something and add my voice to the outrage, but I really couldn't find out where there was something that was just still unsettled in me. It actually took me a couple days to identify that, and what it was the unnerving view of this Asian police officer, Tu Tao, who was staring at the camera, so to speak, while the white police officer murdered a black man. And I said in this article that I wrote that it was basically a parable of the times, which is a white man keeping a black man down, and an Asian person refusing to intervene. And that's what it was to me. It really spoke to me because to that point, I would say in up till May 2020, I feel like I never really had to intervene in the race conversation. I chose to intervene at times. I chose to speak out. But I didn't have to. And I could navigate through society. I could drive on a highway. I could, apply to a school. I could apply for a job and not have to engage necessarily with that racial conversation. And I think we lost Dave, but he'll be back soon. I'm still he can watch the recording. But
Keep talking.
For me in that moment, seeing that Asian police officer ignoring what was going on behind him, I saw so much of myself in that I really sort of wrote this piece as a way to cathartically sort of confess that I don't want to walk away anymore. I don't want to look away. I want to use whatever position I have in the society to be able to speak out against that. And my charge was really to Asian Americans that may have lived in the same sort of niche in society, is to no longer passively just accept the benefits of the privileged culture, but to use whatever platform they have to speak out about what they are seeing.
Well, Pastors Kat and Deandre, I'd love to hear your thoughts about what Pastor Rich just said.
Pastor Deandre, you want to go first?
Yeah, so I definitely I was reading Pastor Lee's article on the George Floyd issue and the Asian American turning his back on on the dehumanizing of Blackness. I think it's definitely something that we see happening a lot of times in conversation with racism in America. And there was some language I thought that was used earlier, the choice to either associate with privilege or to associate with your cultural identity. And where do we give up? What do we choose to give up on? And then I guess for me, that's where I really like to draw the distinction. I think because people often try to really bring up the emphasis that other groups in America have been oppressed and they've been marginalized, or they've experienced these different dehumanizing moments in history. And while they have, there's a privilege that Blackness is not afforded. And we don't have the luxury of being able to navigate a space and not be associated with our culture. We even you talk about the diversity in the Asian community, that same diversity exists in the African American community, or the community of Blackness, that every individual that is Black is not necessarily an African American, but they are distinguished by the very fact that they're Black. And at the end of the day, wealth or not, they are described, or they are defined by their skin color. And so when we talk about those experiences and just the luxury of being able to turn your back on a group of people who's being dehumanized, I think that's another characteristic of Blackness, is that for every other minority group in this country, I think most would agree that if you affirm the humanity in Blackness, every other group's humanity is affirmed. And while at the same time, it's possible to affirm the humanity in our Asian Americans while still dismissing the humanity in African Americans, are again, that being very careful even with the distinction or the use of people of color. like there's a depth to that. It's not, it goes so much deeper than just making a broad term for people of color. For African Americans, for Black people, we know that for all other groups, whether it's been women's rights, whether it's the issues with the LGBTQ community, most often none of those groups have approved or have succeeded in obtaining their humanity without the efforts of Blackness. But for some reason, we still see Blackness being refused their human dignity. And I think that's where I wrestle the most. And I find myself in tension when I hear these arguments still coming up of, yes, other groups have been oppressed and et cetera. But there was this invitation, invited to come to America and work on the railroad system. Even if it was for, pennies on a dollar, there was still this invitation to, whereas the African American at the end of the day has always been taken hostage. They've always been stripped from their communities and et cetera. And so I really like to draw that distinction as we talk about that common ground. And even when we talk about fusion politics, again, there's been this constant effort for the African American to stand in solidarity with other individuals who are oppressed and marginalized. But it's just now, more recently, that we've started seeing those same people groups that we've stood in solidarity with, standing in solidarity with us.
That's powerful. Kat, I'd love to hear just any reflections you have on all of this.
I think to go back to Rich's invitation to speak up, I think it's important for Asian Americans to ask themselves where their silence has come from. And several authors, Kathy Park Hong is one of them that come to mind. They talk about something called minor feelings, something like how silence has been formed as a trauma response to the racism that we've experienced. It's become our shelter. When we don't know the language, we kind of shut our shame, we swallow it, we stifle our tongues. It's become an inheritance of something of ours. And I like to say that if silence is the scar that has formed over trauma, then it's hardened over time into indifference. And so the question of am I my brother's keeper is a question that ashamedly, it's a question that we wrestle with. Why should I speak up? And that cost, why are we staying silent? And Deandre, you pointed out really well that we have the privilege of that choice to speak up. And if we're found in this weird triangulation between we can aspire to whiteness and then there's Blackness, do we choose anti-Blackness in order to align ourselves with whiteness? Do we say, no, we don't want to be like Black people. Let's try align ourselves with white people. And in doing so, we are in this really precarious position where we're we could be the outsider at any point in time, as Dave talked about before, or we could be like a model minority. So it's that oscillating, and the silence that fuels that oscillating has kept us going. And so the only comment I will make in that is just, we need to question where our silence comes from. And does it come from us trying to align with whiteness? And in doing so, perpetuating anti-Blackness.
Yeah. And I mean, even in, with that, continuing that conversation with with whiteness being an ideology, it starts in a skin, for the Asian American, it is the privilege of having a lighter complected skin than the African American. And so for the African American, for someone like Oprah Winfrey, who, for the most part in a society can function out of whiteness, there are those moments where her skin tone is a reminder that she is not a benefactor of the white community, that you are in your place. And for the Asian community, it is because of that lighter skin that you can navigate into that space. I mean, you had for a while where Asian women were said to be bleaching their skin to get a lighter complected skin, to live into this not just ideology, but the skin but this skin layer. When you talk about the poor whites in the South, one of the things that aids in that ideology is the fact that their skin tone reminds poor blacks, at the end of the day, my skin will still get me things and give me privileges and rights that because of your skin tone, you do not have access to. And so I think we have to highlight that it does start with the skin, like that skin tone is the identifier. And so now, in order to break down that superiority, we have to start with, well, it started here. And so how do we unpack that? And what does it look like for us to do that? And, what is it like for our Asian Americans to stand in solidarity and to affirm, where is my silence coming from? And why is it that I would choose to benefit from my silence?
I would say I appreciate your comments and your challenge, DeAndre. As I think about, and if we were just able to stare at, even a timeline and just have an honest look at it, there's no way that I would have any standing in this society if it weren't for the efforts of Black people who fought for civil rights. And there's no way that my parents could have immigrated here in the 60s, early 70s, to be in this country to raise a family, for my father to go to medical school. And then none of that would have happened if it weren't for the millions of people that went before them, the Black people that went before them. And so the reality is, no Asian person, I think, with any sense of integrity could look at the society today and not see that our standing and acceptance in our society is standing on the shoulders of the heroes of the Black faith and the Black civil rights movement. One of the things that I think I've realized since 2020 is, for Asian people that are on this call, for Asian people that are watching this, we believe a lie that we can assimilate. We believe that we can associate with whiteness because, you know what? I feel closer to white. I live in white suburbs. I, work at white jobs. I go to, white supermarkets and restaurants, or whatever that means in your society. And you think that you can assimilate to white society. And then a virus from China comes to America, and the economy goes in the tank, and all of a sudden, all of the very tiny thread that we were hanging by and getting by for many years is suddenly broken. And we realize that, you know what? We are just one virus away from being outcasts in this society. And, I've said for years, we're one nuclear bomb away from North Korea, from being completely ostracized. Imagine, Arabs after 9/11. I don't want to minimize or to, say anything like that. But, I can envision a world where if we have a nuclear attack by, North Korea, or engage in a war in some, with some other Asian country, like Asian Americans, place in society is going to be rocked at the very foundation. And we're going to find ourselves in a position that we're not used to. And the fact of the matter is, if we're being honest, so many Asian Americans, and not all of them, but many Asian Americans do have a place and a power and a privilege in the society. And I would challenge you, if you are not using that for the society overall, for the dignity and loving our Black and brown brothers and sisters, then when it is quote unquote our time, like we're seeing this rise of anti-Asian hate that is in the news and that is going on right now. This is a time where we are experiencing a rise of hate crimes. But it's been a difficult year over the past year, but we should be looking to our brothers and sisters who have gone through this for decades, and be learning from them and about where we associate and where we assimilate, and how we identify ourselves in the society. And so, really, this is something that I'm learning, that I'm sure that our Asian brothers and sisters are all learning, and really need to just continue to listen to the voices that are speaking into this.
So I wonder, I find this so interesting, and I'm so thankful for what you guys have been saying, and I mean, challenging things. I mean, this is just really been just real and powerful. DeAndre, I'm wondering if you would be willing to pick up a little bit with where you left off. As we think about, I think one of the things we've been doing is connecting the way that Asian Americans, and of course we could add Arab Americans, as Richard talked about, or Latino Americans. I mean, there's so many other folks who would experience the same thing, that they're neither at the top of the caste system nor at the bottom, and yet are realizing that we're all connected in this same system. Given that, I'm wondering, DeAndre, how do you see that the racism experienced by Asian Americans is similar to or different from what you're aware of with African Americans? And where do you feel like there's maybe conflict, or where there could be common cause?
Yeah, I think the one common ground is that at the end of the day, we are not white Americans. And even when we talk about defining whiteness, we have to understand that whiteness in the concept of America is not just white-skinned individuals, it is white males. And then even deeper, not just white males, but white males who own land. And so when we look at our Asian brothers and sisters and the African American community, I mean, even for the Asian community, when I look at the distinctions between that community and Blackness, there's a chance for the Asian American. For the African American, we are constantly reminded of that not being a chance. Even you look at the Boston education system now, Boston school systems are still doing busing forms. They're not using the language, but they're busing in African American students into affluent communities, but taking them back to what they would call slums. When instead, how do we fix these things is that you pour into these communities. And for the Asian community, Asians can move into a white neighborhood and property value continues to skyrocket. The moment that a Black family moves into that neighborhood, the property value declines and we start to see a turnover. And so it's those type of things that are still happening that I think we have to make that distinction. And again, the biggest thing for me is going to be that the Asian community, regardless of what may have been happening in another land, that they were being dehumanized or mistreated, it was always either an invitation or they sought to come to the land. For the African American, there was a stripping. You didn't have a choice. And even now, when we look at these systems that are still being perpetuated and things that are that America has taken, and it has still become a part of America. I was talking with a pilot this week who was sharing with me some details about just language that's used when they're flying an airplane, and how terminology for turning the autopilot on in the captain is called turn on George. Well, understanding the Southern connotation of that term, turn on George, the slave, the African American who works and you don't have to watch, or who does what is expected of them. And so these different systems that are still put in place to remind people of color their place. When we talk about multiculturalism, I mean, even now, is Blackness still going to be valued when it's not a fad any longer? When it's not going to determine if your church is relevant anymore? Are you still going to stand in solidarity with us because you care about my humanity? Or is this really a concern of your institution and the survival of your institution? And I think when both of our groups, the Asian community and the African American community, come together and acknowledge that at the end of the day, if we become a threat to whiteness, whatever privilege that you've had access to, whiteness will remind you that you are not white and you are subordinate to who they are. And so what does it look like for us to come together and not even for people for the African American community, but what does it look like for Asian Americans and for other people groups in America to stand with people of color? And I think I really want to push this agenda of not normalizing oppression and marginalization, because what happens is people miss, I think, what people of color, and when I use that terminology, I'm thinking specifically of African Americans, of what it is that they've experienced from the prison system, from all of these different things that are still in place, from the real estate market, from our kids in school systems, that if we see a person of color, we see them serving as custodians, or, because I'm loud as an African American, now I must be unruly, or I'm not conforming. Or if I want to accept a job that is acceptable in society, I have to change how I speak, and I have to dress a certain way. In schools, I mean, even again, the Asian community, you're not going to school where they're putting, these dress codes in that, I'm a Black kid and you can't wear cornrows to school because that's a sign of gang related behavior. And God forbid we bring that into our school system. And so those type of things, until, Black history is no longer being isolated to 1 month, and not just 1 month, but it's isolated to the I have a dream speech. And so until we start to deal with those things, I think there's going to continue to be a tension between the African American community and the Asian community. And that's something that I think is not often talked about, of the tension that does exist between these two groups, and it not just being something that whiteness has combated, but I think a lot of it, again, has to do with African Americans having to stand on the island alone and no one else being willing to speak up for our humanity, but us always coming to the forefront to stand into solidarity with other individuals who are being oppressed.
Yeah, Pastor DeAndre, I think it's great, and just such a helpful reminder. And we really don't talk about Asian and Black tensions. I know growing up in New Jersey, hearing about that a lot. Growing up, about what was going on in Long Island and things like that. One of the things that as I was thinking about what you were saying, I think I affirm that Asian Americans need to include Black lives into the conversations and the things that we fight for. I think the plight of the immigrant is a unique experience, and I think something that Asian Americans oftentimes will face, especially early on, right? I mean, we're only 1, 2, 3 generations, most Asian Americans, and so I think there is space for us to be able to have conversations around Asian American rights, Asian American experiences, and all of those things. And so, to experience and have those conversations, to fight for those things, and to have a perspective that includes the reach of Native Americans and African Americans and as especially our Black brothers and sisters. So, but there is something that is I just wanted to call that out, because I don't want to play into the narrative that Asian people don't have a place to talk about their own rights and their own experiences as suffering, because we haven't suffered like Black people. It partly also because that really plays into our hearts as Asian Americans. We'd love to be invisible. We love to be unseen. We love to not make a fuss. And I don't want Asian people to feel like that's an option anymore. I want us, the challenge for me, to myself and to, the Asian people that I'm interacting with is, no, we have to see this as an opportunity for us to be able to speak out for Asian lives, but also include Black lives as well. I just want to, make sure that we are carving out safe space for Asian Americans to have their own discussion and speak into their own suffering and things like that. But obviously within the context of the overall suffering of Black people in America.
Yeah, I think that's what, so my request is, even in that, first, I think it's so important that as when we were having these discussions about racism, I was telling some students this just last week, that we have to first, you need to learn your own story, and learn that story and see how it fits into this narrative of, the American story when we talk about the caste system in America. And so, but I guess the tension that I have is when these discussions are had and it's like this, we're trying to find a commonality to do, because what happens then is people then look at the African American community and say, well, the Asian community seems to have done very well and they've, been able to acquire X amount of wealth in this country. Why is it the African American cannot do this? Well, the problem is that these two narratives are two completely different stories, and a story that is continuing to be perpetuated in this country. And even I think another benefit that highlights the statement earlier of being able to choose, do I live out of my privilege or do I live out of, my identity as an Asian American? I think the other luxury is, you go to Google now and you type in words like thug or drug dealer or criminal or fear and hate, and what pictures come up and are associated with that. When you look on the news and what pictures are associated with that, you're going to see this clear distinction that the African American, and even if we go deeper, not just the African American, but right now there's this genocide on the African American male. And so like that distinction there, that for the Asian American, when you hear the term Asian, my question even to my Asian brothers and sisters and even to whiteness, what pictures come to mind? Well, I'll tell you, when you Google it, what happens is you see a doctor with a stethoscope around his neck, or a surgeon, or all of these other prestigious living into whiteness abilities and imagery, compared to the African American, where we are constantly reminded of the oppression and et cetera that we've experienced in this country. And so I want to make those distinctions to say we want to stand in solidarity together. But when we're having these conversations, you can't have the same expectation for the African American community when we still have systems that are contributing to how the narrative started in this country.
Yeah, and I think it's the role of I totally agree. I think it's the role of Asian Americans when we are being positioned as a model minority to reject that, reject the notion outright, and to say it's not the same. You can't use Asian Americans as a way. I read an article this week on a conservative evangelical blog site that used Indian Americans as a reason why society is not racist against blacks, which is absurd. I literally couldn't believe it got published. But and it is our role in our unique space, right, to learn our story, to identify our own place in society. It is in that unique place as Asian Americans where we are being weaponized by white people against black people to say, no. That is a false narrative, and I reject that outright, and do not use me, and don't use my people that way.
And I want to just jump in and say, I think we, as Asian Americans, we do need to call out, expose and reject the ways that white supremacy, if we're going to call it white supremacy, attempts to kind of divide and conquer us in that respect, and calling it back to, and I think that's calling out the model minority out of ourselves and saying, kind of like, exercise this thing, not exercise. Because you do hear kind of in these family circles, you do hear the anti-blackness come out, especially when it comes to the anti-Asian racism. Like, oh, we need more policing, we need more retributive means, and it's a conversation that's upon us as Asian Americans to say, hold up, where does this thought come from that we need suddenly like more policing? Where do we need more quote unquote law and order? Why are you suddenly calling people thugs? Why are you calling black people thugs? Why do you think that we're successful because you see us as a doctor, a lawyer, etc.? And I think so, calling out those narratives and calling them the lies that they are, and saying, hey, there's a broader picture of oppression that's happening to our black and brown brothers and sisters that's not happening to us. Yes, understand our own story, but calling out lies where we see them. And the model minority myth is important. And so I think in coming out of that, we can imagine, restorative solutions that center abundance and solidarity and transformation and all these things. But it's calling out, we need to do family business here, Rich, that kind of thing. Yeah. It's. I was thinking about that, and I was reminded of when I did jail ministry during my undergrad, and I remember I invited kind of one of my preppy, privileged African American friends to go to the jail with me and to participate with me. And he comes in, he's got his short golfing shorts on, and he's again been privileged, and he walks into the jail cell and he sees that there are white people in the jail. And he looks at me and he's shocked, and I'm like, you didn't know white people are criminals too? And so just, to see this shock as
that narrative just shifted, and I had completely forgot about that. And as you were talking, I was just reminded of this look on his face when he was faced with reality that the face that you've been given for crime is not, fully, it's not accurate.
Well, I love the things that you guys are saying. I feel like I could listen to this for a long, long time, but I want to get other people into the conversation, bring in some of their questions. And so folks who are watching, if you, in your comments, actually, just like I'm going to show Kevin's comment here, Kevin's got a question and he puts a little Q at the beginning, which helps me find it more easily among all the other questions. But he asks specifically, Richard and Kat, we discussed how being Asian American often requires us to morph our identity based on our circumstance. While we've discussed a lot about racism in the American context, how do we bring the conversation to the racism that is pervasive in our Asian context as well?
Okay. I think so. The first thing that comes to mind, it might not be the whole span of the answer that maybe Kevin you're looking for, but I think bringing to light colorism and and the prejudices and biases and discriminations that manifest itself within different Asian communities. I mentioned, the Asian American experience is not a monolith, and I think it is. And I think when we think of Asian, we immediately think of East Asian, but that's not the reality. And who are we leaving out by just centering East Asian? So I'm a Southeast Asian. There are many other, ethnicities that are Southeast Asian. There's South Asian. There's no one on, of South Asian heritage on this panel. So whose stories are we leaving out? Whose stories are we ignoring? Anti-Blackness within the Asian community against people of darker skin color, questioning where that comes from. That all plays into it. So the first thing I thought of was colorism.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I thought was, my childhood was like, being Asian 1.0. I feel like I'm in being Asian 2.0. And I feel like this question sort of tackles this idea of being Asian 3.0. Like, I honestly don't, I feel like there is a safety and a comfort in the association of the monolith of Asian Americans, because if we separated by Filipino American and Korean American, it'd be so hard to be included in the conversation, right? Because you're not even talking about Pacific Island or South Asian, all these different things, and so there's a sense of solidarity and strength in the grouping, but that grouping is so problematic. But then even when you group by race, I mean, my parents are Korean and immigrated to America, and my son and my daughter are a Korean American. But I feel like Kat, I probably have more in line with your experience because of, the age. I don't know, maybe you're not as old as I am, but because of our age, as opposed to what my parents faced and what my children are facing. And so, like, even within Korean American, like, there's a very wide gap of, wide array of what the experience is. I will say that I think in all of this, the theme is really what we're doing here is partly, conversation, getting in a relationship, and learning about the experiences of others. And, I don't know what the Filipino American immigration experience has been. I think I could probably project, some of it, but I don't really know what that was like. I know what Korean Americans, that are my age pretty much faced in the, areas where I grew up. And so I think that there's a lot of, needing to reach across and be able to learn from other Asians, as opposed to just saying like, oh, Kat, she's Asian. Like, I know how she grew up. one of the stats, I'll just say this, throw this out, like from a couple years ago, was that the minority that was had the highest poverty rate in New York City was Asian Americans. And that was surprising to me to hear. And I was thinking, man, I need to know different Asians, because the only Asians that I know in New York City are, living in Manhattan or in Brooklyn and not facing poverty. And yet, I think 27% of Asian Americans were facing poverty in New York City. And I was like, this is not my experience. And so I needed to learn. I need to learn more about what those experiences are like.
Okay, I'm going to bring up another question. I think this is great. The question here is, how do we draw a distinction between assimilating into the majority culture and trying to piggyback on white privilege? Some things being shared, I've seen in the complete opposite scenario. For example, white families, China and Taiwan, and teaching their kids Mandarin, Chinese culture, etc. So what's the difference between just going along, getting along, participating in kind of broader American culture and trying to piggyback on white privilege? Is there a way to, are there kinds of assimilation that aren't necessarily trying to take on white privilege?
That's a tough question. And so if others want to speak, I'm take the floor. But one thing that I'm thinking about is so my son is 1 year old and he does something and he looks to me and he waits to see if I clap or, react in some way. And he's learning about the world, and he learns about the world through my reaction partially. And so I think, I don't know if there's a very clear distinction, but I think when you look to a norm for validation, that is trying to align with whiteness. And that is using your proximity to whiteness as privilege. So if you do something, or, if you try to accomplish something, I'm not saying these things are bad. Like, I want to move to a nice neighborhood. I want to go to a good school, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not saying these things are bad, but ask, why do you think this is a good neighborhood? How did it get there? How, what kind of school do you want your kids to go to? Why do you want your kids to go there? And then ask, who are you looking towards to say, hey, is this good? Am I doing well? Is this the American dream? Am I finally getting there? And so, yeah, it might be assimilation. I think it's tough for me to kind of draw lines between them, but validation seems like a good check for someone, check for oneself.
And I think that, so even when we say like assimilating into majority culture, like at the end of the day, that's whiteness. And so a deeper question for me is, and I struggle with white families that go into Black communities, or you're adamant about wanting to go and adopt a Black child, or you're adamant about wanting to go and take a Chinese baby, or you're going to move to China and learn again what was used here, their language in Mandarin and their culture. Well, culture is a lot more than just their food. And it's a lot more than just learning the language. And why are you doing that? Are you doing this because you sincerely want to learn about this people group? Or are you doing this out of the luxury of whiteness? And whiteness is that you have the freedom to go and to do as you please. And you can, if you want something, you have the right to appropriate it. And so I'm more concerned about, why is it you desire to go into this space? What do you gain from it? And is it about you gaining something? Or are you going even with the idea of giving? Like, who said that you have something worthy to give and that they need what you have? What if it's really like there's something here for you to learn? And so the American hero culturalism of, we know what's best and we know the right way to do things. And so when we talk about assimilating or, piggybacking off of white privilege, we assimilate so that we can piggyback. We assimilate so that we can benefit from whatever the given culture is in that space. And my argument and my motivation is always, if we're trying to tear down these walls, then it means that for my Asian brothers and sisters, whether you're second or third generation, that you're intentional to hold on to the language of your people, and that you understand, how valuable this is to your people, and you don't feel less than a human being because you choose to speak in a language that Americans don't understand. And you're in a restaurant and they say, "Oh, we use English here." Well, who cares that you don't understand what I'm saying? And so I think really setting those precedences and asking those questions of why is it so important that we move into this space and that we take this food? I find it so ironic of my white brothers and sisters who are just so anti-immigration, but every week we get together or we got to have a meeting. You want to go to a Mexican restaurant. Like, or you want soul food. Like, our culture is so much more than just our food. And stop, if you don't want all of me, then stop looking for those things that you can benefit from or that entertain you.
Yeah, that's good. I when I read this question, Alexander, I think, I think it's a matter of, in some ways, right? There's this continuum of privilege. It's really a continuum of power, and there's no position that is better than the other, that is more righteous than the other, right? Like, wherever you are along this power continuum, it's not necessarily about where you are positioned as much as I think was where you are pointed. And you can be anywhere along this continuum, but it's where you are using that power and for whom and where to whom you're pointed. So you can sit atop the continuum, you can be the CEO, you can be in the boardroom, but it's whom you're speaking for in that boardroom. And if you're not in the boardroom, then there's ways that in the streets you can do the same thing. But it's not about, just because you're in the boardroom, you're assimilated. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is, you're assimilated if you're in the boardroom and you're not speaking up for people that can't get access to the boardroom. Just like people in the streets, that you're not speaking up for people that need to be spoken up for. And by the way, I mean, all throughout Scripture, we as Christians, that's what we're called to do, is to give voice to the voiceless. And so wherever you are in that continuum, think about who is not represented here and who cannot get to this position, because I got to this position somehow by God's grace, and I better use this power and position pointed at people who can't get there.
Wow. That's the best definition for assimilation I've ever heard.
Write it down quick.
We got to record it.
We have a saying that the first time I give you credit, the second time it's common knowledge. I don't have to reference you anymore.
Okay.
It's yours.
I just want to put in this comment. This is not a question in particular, but Kevin is responding to kind of our response to his first question, or your response. And he says, I also believe that part of the reason why the Asian American community hasn't stepped up to support our Black brothers and sisters is that we haven't addressed our own culture's racism towards Blacks. And, I do think, at least in the United States context, that there is a particular story between the Black community and the Korean community that really has some history. And it's important, if we're going to end up having honest dialogue, we've got to be able to talk about and unearth. Richard, I wonder if you can kind of dive into that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, so many of the immigrant stories include opening up stores in African American neighborhoods and facing, racism and racial attacks from the Black community. I grew up really with the narrative that the generation before me, my parents' generation, not necessarily my parents, but my parents' generation of, having this sort of deep-seated racism against Black people. And, when we think about, the LA riots, I think a lot of people think about, Rodney King, and they think about the white police officers. I think of, that riot heading to Koreatown, and taking over the stores. And, we all probably remember the pictures of the Asian, the Korean store owners with guns, sitting on the top of the roof, with their guns pointed at Black people to stop from the looting. And so, I mean, the narrative of tension is absolutely there. I think that hasn't been my experience. And so, it's hard for me to speak into, what people who have had that sort of tension and experience, how they need to address that. But I think just with any tension, right? Like whether you have tension with people of a certain race or not, we as Christians, we are called to bring that to the cross and to crucify that, and whatever that takes, to get into community with people like, that you have these deep-seated racist hatred, thoughts about. And so the challenge for us is absolutely to face that, that the racism of Asian Americans against Blacks head on. I'll say, for me, like one of the churches that I've been going to in quarantine is a Black church in Virginia. And it's, something that I met, it's a church that I became accustomed to, and it gave me an opportunity to introduce my family to that. And one of those things that has I'm just mindful of is that I'm so glad that my children are able to sit under a Black preacher and then discuss about the things that he said, because I did not have that experience. I didn't have Black teachers growing up. I didn't have Black preachers that we listened to. And so for me, I had to do a lot more lifting of that veil and that lie of that false narrative about Black people in my life, that I'm trying to look around the dinner table and look on the Sunday couch and really trying to correct that narrative, at least in the next generation.
I want to bring up another comment here. This is, again, not a question, but I just think it's a great comment. This is from Teresa. She said, I appreciate Pastor DeAndre's point about the Asian American experience not being the same as the Black American experience and the history behind that. But I also appreciate Pastor Richard's point that there has to be a space where we talk about racism that Asian American and Pacific Islanders are facing, both for the healing and for facing the issues. Otherwise, what happens is that we're silent and we don't have a place at the table at race discussions. And actually, that is one of the real hearts behind this event. I think what we've done is, and some of you were saying this earlier, we've pitted the experience of Black Americans against those of Asian Americans, and then invalidated one or the other, rather than being able to make space and say, hey, both of the stories are real and important and painful. So anyway, I feel like it is important that we recognize, yes, Asian Americans have had a different experience than African Americans, and in many ways, the African American experience is worse. But that doesn't mean that the Asian American experience isn't also really important and really terrible. So anyway, I don't know if you guys have any comments on that, but I just thought that was a comment that was worth sharing.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's like when you ask somebody how they're doing during the pandemic, it's like, I don't really want to say I'm doing terribly.
Fine.
Right. It's like pandemic fine. Right. It's like I'm doing terribly. I'm depressed and I'm bored and I'm lonely, but I can't say anything because I have a job and I have my health. And it doesn't minimize the experience. And unless we actually, from a mental health perspective and a spiritual health perspective, unless we actually take time to investigate that, we will be much worse off as a person and unable to carry the weight of a conversation of, mourning a death or a loss of job. And so, I mean, absolutely, Pastor DeAndre, like, totally agree that the Black experience has been far worse than the Asian American experience, even given the past year of, anti-Asian racism that we're seeing. I mean, we've had a hard year. I mean, like, we can't even begin to, talk about, any sort of comparison, but there is a necessity for us as Asian Americans to use our voice to speak out against that. And I will say, there are Asian Americans that are now speaking out against racism that they wouldn't use their voice, in the Black conversation, for better or for worse. Well, it's for worse, but for better or for worse. But they are speaking out now, and they're building a muscle. They're building a habit being able to see, they're building a lens to be able to see that racism and to be able to speak out against it. And, so I think wherever, again, sort of wherever you are in that continuum of your perspective of Asian American, dealing with Asian American racism is to use your voice to speak out.
I want to add that it's important for Asian Americans to talk about racism that we've experienced, yes, for healing, but also for a communal remembering. I think there is a tendency that we have that when we stay silent, that there's a forgetting of what happened to us. And I'll actually I affirm everything you said, Pastor Rich, I do. I think the history of racism experienced by Asians goes very, very deep, historically, very, very deep. And these stories don't come up because we've forgotten to talk about them. We've forgotten to say them. We've forgotten to speak up. And it's in this forgetting that, like, it's that scar tissue that I talked about. Every time, a new virus comes up or threats of nuclear war comes up, it gets ripped out again. And then we realize, like, oh, we are in pain. And yes, it's a muscle, talking about racism and engaging in anti-racism is a muscle that we learn, and it's painful. That journey is painful. But we need to be able to do that together and hold that space together, because there's a risk of it forgetting, and then another generation comes along and then we're like, wow, this hurts. So I think it's important to speak that truth, that what has happened to us is wrong, and find rootedness and an ability to find solidarity, kind of, out of that place.
Yeah. And I think, so I guess one of my encouragements would be just to definitely affirm what you're saying, Pastor Kat. But I think, like, even in that, I want to, like, highlight the gift and the privilege and the ability to forget.
Yes.
Like that.
Yes.
That's not a luxury that the African American community has had. And I want to say, like, there's got to be an encouragement for, and I've met, talked with, Asian members, even when I first arrived at Highrock, of the conscious decision of their elders who chose not to talk about these stories, or they want to detach themselves so much from it. And so even when we talk about heightened police brutality, as America was forced to see what African Americans have lived with for 402 years. It's not something new for us, and it's not new for America. It's just that now all of the world's eyes were on America, that now we finally had evidence that couldn't be corrupted, that now America was faced with having to make a conscious decision. And I think one of the things that makes the African American experience so unique is because we've experienced the dehumanizing acts that we've experienced from, I was, again, sitting with a student who was frustrated about this emphasis on highlighting Blackness in literature and et cetera. I began to take him through some things and asked him, did you know that in the South, they would cut body parts of the African American and mail them to people as postcards or pose with pictures of bodies hanging from trees and et cetera. And I think because we've experienced such dehumanizing acts, it is what has fueled our ability to stand in solidarity with other people groups, in that we've not had anybody else to put beneath us. And so we've always had to stand on the shoulders of other African Americans, and before African Americans, the Africans that have been stripped from their land. And so when we look at these other people groups, it's my prayer and my hope is that as they learn their stories, as they face their truth, that they are able to stand in solidarity with the African American, and that they understand the unique connection, that even though there's a vast difference in our stories, there is a connection. And that connection is that we've all been deprived of our human dignity. But we can't stand in that solidarity if our Asian brothers and sisters are not sitting down to hear those stories. And the South, it's nothing for us to go to go and sit at the feet of Big Mama, who's 70 or 80 years old, and can pull her shirt over and allow me to see the whip from where the hose hit her, or stretch her hands out to me and I can see the cuts from her picking cotton, or even these symbolic things that still exist in the South. I remember I was driving to Willacoochee, Georgia, and it's a real place. And I'm driving and there are no power lines. And I'm looking out to the left and I will never forget this first experience of acres and acres and acres of cotton. And I remember pulling my car over and going out to the field and sticking my hand down and just trying to pick a piece of the cotton. And it was in that moment for me, I began to lament. And I lamented in the privileges that I had not taken advantage of, the stories that I had not sat to fully be present with. And so I think there is something to be said about the luxury and the privilege of being able to forget, but also the responsibility to sit and not forget, but intentionally lean in and to hear those stories. And last thing I'll say is that for me, as I reflect on the last 6 to 10 years, I've understood the African American experience better because I took the trip to Germany and I learned about the Jewish Holocaust, because I went to Africa and I learned about the Great Lakes, because I went to Peru and learned the Peruvian stories, and now because I've served in X amount of white churches and have sat with police officers and other individuals, that these different stories of different people groups, from the Montagnard mission to the Mongolian people and the Mongs, being able to sit with them and to hear their stories have helped me understand my story better.
Mm-hmm.
Amen.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we could keep this going for a long time, but we've been going for a while and I want to close up. I want to close with some action steps. I mean, I feel like we have heard so many things that are powerful and emotional and true, but then it'd be very easy to go back to our busy lives and kind of go, oh, okay, next problem, next thing, whatever. I also think it's very easy to say, oh, here's what society needs to do. Here's what our nation needs to do. Here's what someone else needs to do. And so I wonder, just as pastors in our church, what would you say to those of us who are watching this individually, or to us as a church? What do we need to be doing in order to learn from some of these things that you guys have been addressing tonight?
I eat with people. I model, for me, a meal is sacred, and I model that meal after the disciples' meal with Jesus. That I sit with people and I want to eat your meal, and I want to hear the stories of your family. And sometimes that means going into those spaces. Again, the greatest lesson that I learned when I went to Africa. And I remember, and so there was this tension that I remember hearing growing up about Africans and African Americans, and Africans not really honoring African Americans because we had been civilized or colonialized. And so when I got to Africa, an African bishop signaled for me. He was a Lutheran bishop, and I walked over to him and he said, "My brother," he said, "I want you to know that when you succeed, we rejoice, and when you fail or when you are hurt and oppressed, we lament. And our heart breaks for you under the president that you're under." But the most profound statement that he said to me was, he said that we want you to know that you always have a home in Africa. And for the African American to not be able to identify with America as home and to go into this other land, but it was because of my posture to learn. I wasn't there as the American who had the answers. I was there to be a student of a culture and how they had dealt with conflict and the different wars and things that were going on there. So I think it has to be a posture of humility and sincere curiosity of, I want to know about you to better understand you. And it's not about me gaining anything from that. And I think that's so hard. Like, we have to really interrogate our intentions and our reasons behind eating with people, behind hearing people's stories. What are you going to do with that? That's a very vulnerable and sacred part of a person. And when they give you their story, you need to cherish it as such.
It's a good word. Anything that you'd want to add, Kat or Richard?
Piggybacking off of that, listening to where people are crying out, listening, learning to lament. My own kind of journey in learning how to be anti-racist, and I'm still, Lord help me, still on this journey, was when I was leading a conference, and we were looking at the story of the Good Samaritan, and I posed the very, very generic question of like, are you like the Pharisee who walks by? Are you like the, judge who walks by? And one of my Black students was like, I'm the person on the road who's bruised and beaten. Everyone's walking by and no one's paying attention to me. And that was a moment where the Holy Spirit said, you need to listen. So it's the work of the Holy Spirit, but it's me saying, I've built up a lot of false narratives. I've built up a lot of walls. I've built up a lot of barriers. Yes, I've done this in privilege. I haven't used what I have to serve and to love and be in solidarity with the people that you are in solidarity with, Jesus. So I guess my invitation is, in entering into solidarity and allyship, it's laying your life down and listening and saying, let's lean into these conversations, and in the spirit of listening, asking the Holy Spirit to sift through your narrative, sift through these things, and say which things are of you and which things are, have come out of an idol of wanting to be white.
I don't have much to add. I mean, I think that those are really good. I'll say two very practical things. I'll say, piggybacking off of what Deandre has been saying all along, if you're an Asian American, go buy a meal or, take a coffee to someone who is Black and just listen and hear their story and learn about their history, learn about their journey. Because you processing your own journey, our own journey, will be so much more enriched by listening and learning from our Black brothers and sisters. The other thing that I would say, because Deandre and Kat have said so many good things, is sometimes you just need to shut up. There was an experience recently online where a church filmed a child's ministry video that ended up being sort of seen as racist by Asian Americans, and worse than the act of the video was actually the minimizing of the people who said that they were offended. And it is the minimizing of people who are speaking out that is that really is I feel like the greater offense. And, if you're one of those people that, tends to speak over people and to reject narratives and things like that, you actually can hold that opinion. You're on your own, but it actually costs you nothing to just be quiet and listen to someone else's conversation. And so, I think it's important to let other people that think differently than you be able to speak into your perspective. And you can walk away and hold the same opinion that you had coming in, but I think it is important to check that opinion based off of what somebody else's experience is.
Well, these are great comments. Thank you guys so much. This whole night has been so helpful, and I feel like there's so much more we could mine from you guys, because all three of you are so thoughtful, not only in terms of interpreting your own experiences as people of color, but just as you're so passionate as Christians and as pastors caring for our church. And so I really am very thankful for that. We know that the church is supposed to be one united body, and that, when one part of the body's hurting, the whole body shares that pain and participates in the healing. And as you guys have said, listening to those stories is a first step. Lamenting with them is the second step. But let's not stop there. I think repentance and action are really going to be needed if there's going to be restoration and health. And I think as a church, this is our call. I know it's complicated. I certainly don't have answers. I'm learning here, and I'm on this journey and learning from people like the three of you. But I appreciate the fact that we can be on this journey together. We can grow and, God willing, experiencing real healing. Everybody who's joined us tonight, thank you as well. We're so glad that you were part of this, and I appreciate the comments that you put in and the way that you guys have contributed to this conversation. And this will be a conversation that I hope we'll continue together as a church. Many blessings. Thank you for joining us tonight.